but I graduated in 2019. So, and I got my BA, excuse me, in both history and English literature. But I wrote my honors thesis in history. And so what I'll do hopefully here is just kind of give a brief outline chronologically in terms of the trajectory that I took in terms of my research journey, and hopefully make it relevant to everybody. I know we have majors from all different areas, but I'll kind of go through some of the struggles and just communication type issues that I had, and how I was able to work through those over the course of my research journey. So for me, I kind of got started thinking about my thesis in the spring of my sophomore year, which I know many of you are sophomores and kind of in that similar position right now. But I had some very broad ideas. I wasn't really sure which direction I wanted to go. I actually was still kind of thinking at that point in time about whether I wanted to do a thesis in literature or in history, but through some conversations with professors one-on-one during their office hours is really how I decided to go the history route. And specifically, a conversation I had with Professor Lawrence Hare, who is now the Director of International Studies and also Professor of History, really kind of helped get me on the right track. And so I was familiar with him. I had him as a professor in H2P, so the Honors Humanities Project, which some of you may have taken. It was in the third semester of that sequence of classes that I had him as a professor. I had already spoken to him a couple of times about different research ideas and just sort of different things I was working on for the class. But I went up to his office, I think it was in April of my sophomore year, and just kind of broached the topic of the honors thesis and brought up a few of my ideas and kind of really broad themes I was interested in, which at the time was social history, urban history, and sort of modern British history, very, very broadly defined. And so I had a really good conversation with him. I asked him if he would be interested in being my thesis mentor during that meeting, and he actually steered me in a different direction. So he said that based on my interests, it sounded like I might work best with a different history professor. So Professor Ren Pepitone, who she's a history professor of modern British history, urban history, and gender history as well. And it actually worked out perfectly. So I didn't get the result that I was sort of hoping for going into that meeting, but Dr. Hare also agreed to be on my committee. He said, why don't you ask her to be your mentor, but I'll still be on your thesis committee. And so I had potentially 2 members of my committee by the end of my sophomore year figured out. So after talking with him, I met with Dr. Pepitone again during her office hours. She was very receptive to some of the ideas that I had, and she gave me some reading suggestions for the summer after my sophomore year. And so that's really how I got started. She gave me some books to read and some resources to look at in the library. And I just kind of started delving a little bit deeper into the thematic areas that I wanted to look at. I also took a class with her. So I actually was taking a class with her at the time during the spring of my sophomore year. It was Modern European History in the 20th Century was the class. But once I knew that she was going to be my mentor, I decided to take another class with her in the spring. So I took, it was actually the history of British film, modern British film. And so it was something a little bit closer maybe to what I wanted to do with my thesis. And that really helped, just to have those extra contact hours and to kind of get to know her teaching methods and kind of how she looked at and viewed history as well, was really helpful. So I would recommend for all of you to try to take a class, if at all possible, with the individuals on your thesis committee, and particularly your mentor would be really helpful. So for me, I did the reading during the the summer after my sophomore year. I kind of honed in on what would eventually be my topic, which was a case study of a specific town in Victorian England. So Brighton, which is a city on the south coast of England, and everyone's saying, why does that matter, right? It was sort of like the first vacation beach town, resort leisure town. And the reason it mattered to me was that there hadn't been a lot written about it in the historiography up to that point. So there hadn't been a lot written about the development of this specific urban space, whereas there had been a ton written about the development of the metropole, so London and other northern industrial centers in both England and the United States. I came across a lot of writing about that. And so that's kind of how I honed in on that Now, why Brighton specifically was because I was also looking at study abroad opportunities at the time. I wanted to go abroad for a semester and decided to go for an exchange semester in Brighton. Actually, it was at the University of Sussex, which I believe is still a exchange opportunity for you all at the U of A sometime in the future, not this spring, but something that you can look into. But in sort of looking at that program and then also doing some background reading at the time, I thought it would be really neat to try to incorporate on-site archival research in this area that I would be studying at into my project. And so that's exactly what I was able to do. So during the fall of my senior year, in addition to applying for a SURF grant, I worked on sort of contacting archivists and librarians at the University of Sussex and at other institutions in this region of England, sort of ahead of time, trying to see if I could maybe work there in the spring of my junior year. And a few individuals were very friendly and receptive to my ideas. And so I was able to kind of have a few points of contact going into that experience. And I did end up working on site at an archive in Brighton during the spring of my junior year. So in terms of contact with my professor while I was in Brighton, sort of poking around in the archives, starting to do some research, we talked via Skype, basically on a monthly basis. And so we talked for maybe about an hour every month. And we also corresponded a little bit via email. But she really just kind of gave me some loose guidance in terms of as I was finding different things, other things to look at and secondary sources to pair with the primary sources in order to kind of help me understand what I was reading and interpret what I was looking at. And so that was my junior year. Oh, I mentioned I applied for the SURF grant. So I actually didn't get the SURF grant, but I got the Honors College Research Grant, which if you apply for the SURF, you can apply for both. And so I was able to use that money to pay for some of the research fees in England. So I had to pay some archive fees and some copying fees and stuff like that. And I also used that money to apply to present at a conference during the spring of my senior year. So after getting back from England the summer before my senior year, I applied to present at the Southern Conference on British Studies. So this would have been in November of my senior year is when that took place. I just had to write a really short abstract. I think it was about 200 words. And so I hadn't really written anything yet. I just had collected a lot of sources and had some very nebulous notes in terms of still very, very broad in terms of what I wanted to eventually argue with my thesis. But applying for that conference and then getting accepted really provided a lot of motivation for me in terms of getting started on the writing process. And so for me, that process did start towards the end of that summer in between junior and senior year. I did a lot of writing in August and September, and then I basically completed what would become the first chapter of my thesis, so about 15 pages by about mid-October of my senior year. I sent it over to my thesis mentor, and she sent back a lot of comments and editing advice, and we went back and forth, I think 2 or 3 times, working on some edits, and then I was able to present at that conference in November of my senior year. So going into winter break, I had this one chapter already written. It was about a specific, I won't go into the details, but it was about a specific neighborhood in this town that I was looking at, and about sort of aristocratic nodes of influence and how they sort of shaped the government of the town. And so I had this one chapter going into winter break, and then I did a lot more writing during that time, and then going into January and February. After I completed each major section of the thesis, I would send it over again to my mentor. So we just kind of had this back and forth process. She would send me comments via just the Microsoft Word comment feature. And then I would work up those edits and send it back to her as I was working on my next chapter of the thesis. So that worked out really well. Yeah, she was really helpful in terms of helping me organize and move around the different sections and the intro and conclusion of my thesis. I would recommend to all of you, no matter what field you're in, certainly consider working with either Zotero or EndNote, which are citation software you may have heard of. This is something I'm working with now in grad school here as a PhD student at Indiana. I didn't really work with it as an undergrad, but it can really help you organize your sources and also organize your notes as well. as you really get heavy into the writing process. So that's another piece of advice. But so spring of my senior year, I defended the thesis in April, I believe. And yeah, it went really well. In sort of working up the writing and going through the editing process with my mentor, we had really created just this great working relationship. And so I was very comfortable by the time I got into that room to defend the thesis. And it was sort of more of a formality at that point, which I think many of you will feel that way after having gone through the process. So yeah, I think I've hit on, I'll look at the questions here and see if there's anything else I might need to answer. But the process overall was just extremely useful for me in terms of looking ahead to graduate school, and sort of my long-term goal is possibly to become a history professor. And so having gone through this process, knowing sort of what it takes to write a longer piece of writing like this, and having then a writing sample to use to apply to graduate schools was something that was just really, really important for me, and something that was very rewarding, even though it did take you know, about 2 years in total to go through the process. So yeah.